That is James Knox Polk on the right. Um, he won the election of 1844, was inaugurated on March 4th, 1845. Shortly before he was inaugurated, while John Tyler was still president, um, Texas actually was annexed into the United States. So that was a done deal. And of course, the Mexican government um, railed against it rhetorically, but you didn't have a war about it just yet. And one of the things Polk wanted to do was basically buy the territory between the Louisiana Purchase and um, uh, and and the Pacific Ocean, and he was willing to pay for it. He was willing to pay $15 million, and he offered that to the Mexican government, and the Mexican government turned him down flat. In the meantime, um, the American Army, the U.S. Army, moved first to the border between Louisiana and what was still the Republic of Texas. It was called the Army of Observation at that point, and then when uh, Texas was annexed into the United States, that army moved in and became what was called the Army of Occupation. Um, and then it did something that for the Mexican government was really kind of unacceptable, and it was kind of the point. Mexico was kind of, sort of, maybe willing to live with a Texas boundary along the Nueces River, but the army crossed over the Nueces River down to Brownsville, which is near the mouth of the Rio Grande, and so now was definitely in territory that Mexico regarded as theirs. And in May 1846, um, Mexican forces crossed the Rio Grande and fought the American forces in two sharp battles that the Americans won. Um, and that was terrific as far as the Polk administration was concerned because he now had a war with Mexico. And Ulysses S. Grant, the future general, and for that matter, president, was at that time a junior officer in this army of observation that became an army of occupation that got involved with these first two fights with Mexican forces. And he said later in his memoirs, he said, "We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was important that the Mexicans, be the ones to start it." And then then what he said was that this began a war that he regarded as one of the most unjust and immoral wars that one could conceive of. It just never felt right morally in his crawl. Well, quite quickly and with minimum effort, American forces got what Polk wanted. Small forces, crossed over the the Rocky Mountains, and got all the way to California. So the Navy helped some, and quite quickly the United States had control over California, which is what they really wanted, and San Francisco, and they really wanted that. And so, hey, they had everything that they needed. The trouble was the Mexican government wouldn't quit the war. And so what now happened was a war to conquer a peace, basically a war that would force the Mexican government to come to the negotiating table. The army that was in the north was under the command of Zachary Taylor, colorful man known as Old Rough and Ready. Um, Once he got a little bit into northern Mexico, though, there was no place to go, really. The only thing worth having was Mexico City. The only way you were going to conquer a peace, quote unquote, was by getting control of Mexico City, and you weren't going to do that um, going southward. However, that did not prevent Santa Anna from sending an army north, personally, um, an army north, and they fought a really sharp battle with the Americans at a place called Buena Vista. it was a really near run thing for a while, but the Americans prevailed. Zachary Taylor was the general in charge of that. He won that victory, and with it, the potential um, for the presidency in the same way that Andrew Jackson had got it, if he wanted it. But the the real campaign that mattered was one that was led by General Winfield Scott, and General Winfield Scott was the senior general in the U.S. Army. He also happened to be a Whig, and Polk was a Democrat. And so Polk sniped at Scott, and actually was kind of afraid that like the Whig generals have come out on top in this war, and then of course they would have an opportunity to run for president, and he really didn't want that. And so he actually kind of loaded the army with amateurish, uh, but Democratic, from members of the Democratic Party. So there were generals who were Democrats. Because they were, in fact, they were Democrats. They would say they're generals because they were Democrats. Yeah, there we go. All right. Um, well, Scott had an idea that turned out to be brilliant, and it was tremendously well executed. Also, in early 1847, he landed an army at the port of Vera Cruz, and on this map, Vera Cruz is down at the very bottom of the map, just about on the Gulf of Mexico side, and then you can see Mexico City inland. He landed at Veracruz. He captured Veracruz. He consolidated it as a port, and then it took his army inland. Now, for a while, his army consisted of regular army forces and volunteer forces, but the volunteer forces, about halfway on the march from Veracruz to Mexico City, kind of like pooped out. Hey, we think our enlistments have expired, and they left. And Winfield Scott was placed in the position of being halfway between Veracruz and halfway between Mexico City. And the Duke of Wellington, the victor of Waterloo, he was still alive and in London. He was following the campaign, and he said, Scott is lost. He can't advance and he can't retreat. Well, Scott wasn't lost, as it turned out, and he was able to advance. And he won several victories that gave him control over Mexico City. He captured Mexico City. Now, he still hadn't conquered a peace because the Mexican government had simply gone elsewhere. But still, at this point, I mean, the Mexican government was pretty close to having to come to the table, and they eventually did. And in early 1848, a treaty of peace was signed at a place called Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the terms were basically, hey, remember all that territory we wanted? We have it, and so we want you to accept that we have the territory, and we would be happy to pay you that same $15 million that we offered you in the first place. And so that was the terms, and also that the United States would take responsibility for some debts that Texans owed to Mexican creditors, and so basically the Texas creditors were off the hook, and the Texas people who owed the money were off the hook, and um, uh, the Mexican creditors, got paid off, and so that was the deal. Now, with this American victory, the United States now had control of, when you include Texas in the bargain, half of the geographical expanse of Mexico. Nowhere near half the Mexican population, because most of that was located south of the Rio Grande and in the vicinity of Mexico City and so forth. But they basically got it. We got half, if you want to say we as being the United States, or being an American, got half of Mexico out of this war. Pretty good stuff. But we got a problem, and the problem cropped up in August 1846, when the war had been going on since June, July. not quite 3 months at this point. And Congress was in session because they had to vote military appropriations to support the war effort. And the Whigs were actually opposed to the war by and large. The Whig Party was unhappy about it. Abraham Lincoln, who at that time was a congressman from Illinois and a Whig, and by the way, was congressman from Illinois for exactly 2 years. But these were the 2 years that he was congressman, and he rose in the House of Representatives and gave a speech that just blasted the Polk administration. I mean, it's a really cool speech. Lincoln was an eloquent man, but the Whigs had learned the lesson from what happened to the Federalist Party when it didn't support the War of 1812, and the Whigs, they were going to support the Mexican War in the sense of providing the military appropriations to prosecute it. And then something kind of funny happened. I think that was a session that went in, well into the night, sort of hot, sweltering night in Washington, D.C. in August of 1846. A Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot got up and made a proposal. And the funny thing about it is he wasn't a Whig, he was a Democrat. So it's a little odd that he was the one who made the proposal, but the proposal was this. Hey, we're going to attach a rider to this military appropriations bill. And what the rider is going to say is that the United States was going to promise that, whether and when it won the war, it would not allow slavery in any territories that it might, quote unquote, acquire as a result of the war. Of course, everybody knew that we'd already acquired a good chunk of what we wanted. And what Wilmot was saying is, no, there's not going to be slavery there. All the territory that we're about to take control of from Mexico City, no slavery there. And you get something that the politicians at the federal level have wanted to avoid for years. You get the intrusion of slavery into national political life in a way that it couldn't get out of. The Whig and the Democratic parties had been evenly matched. You had the Democratic Party was strong in the North, the Whig Party was strong in the North, Democratic Party was strong in the South, Whig Party was strong in the South. And the second party system actually was one of the most evenly matched party systems in American history. And it was kind of nice from the standpoint of the voter because in most congressional districts, you had you basically you could vote for the Whig, you could vote for the Democratic Party. Nowadays, in much of the United States, the congressional districts are so heavily gerrymandered, so stacked in favor of one party or the other, that it's not so much that the voters pick their representatives, rather the representatives pick their voters. So it's the other way around. Well, this was not the case under the second party system. And then the Wilmot Proviso threw all of this into a cocked hat. And the Wilmot's proposal became known as the Proviso. Look at what's going on here. Okay. The yes votes, in terms of, yeah, we agree, there's not going to be any slavery in the territories we get from Mexico. The yes votes are entirely in the North, the Northeast, Pennsylvania, a good chunk of Ohio, all of Michigan, and then kind of getting a little more sketchy in Indiana and Illinois. But look at the South. The no votes are in white or light shading there. And so you're not getting anybody except maybe a little chunk of Kentucky. You're not getting any traction in favor of this Wilmot Proviso from the representatives from the southern states. So now you have a clear regional division between the northern section of the country, and the southern section of the country. And there was no putting that back together again. From then on, as the United States entered the 1850s, you know, slavery was firmly in the national spotlight. Um, Most of the political crises and so on had to do with slavery, and things just went from bad to worse to even worse. And we'll stop there. That's plenty for this week to have to digest, and continue this story next week. So, trying to look how. There we go. Trying to turn off this recording. Now I found how to do it.